All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webcast, Energy Efficiency and Planning for the Modern Grid. I'm Molly Podolewski, a director with Guidehouse, and I'll be the moderator for this session. We'll start this webcast with a few housekeeping items, and then we'll quickly move on to the presenters. I know you guys have been involved in this conference for a couple of days now, so I'm going to go pretty quickly through the housekeeping items. First and foremost, thank you to all of our sponsors and ally members for their support of Energy Efficiency as a Resource Conference and of ACEEE. Please use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions of the presenters. We'll address those at the end of the session. As a reminder, EER attendees will receive a 35% discount on their registration for the BECC, Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. You'll need to use the code BECC21, BECC21-EB Special, all one word, before October 29th to qualify. All right, lastly, we ask that everyone completes the conference evaluation found in the resources. Anyone who completes the evaluation and includes their name and a testimonial will receive a discount to attend the next EER conference in 2023. All presentations will be available for on-demand viewing within a few days on the Engagement Hub. Presenters' PowerPoints can be found on their page in the Program Participants section. And now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. They are Andy Satchwell with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, Natalie Mims-Frick, also with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and Nicholas Wyatt with Eversource Energy. So we'll start with our first speaker, who is Andy Satchwell. Andy is a research scientist and deputy leader in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. His research explores utility motivations to invest in energy efficiency, demand response, electric vehicles, and other distributed energy resources, as well as the ratepayer costs and benefits of those investments. Andy recently co-led the Department of Energy Building Technologies Office roadmap for grid interactive efficient buildings. Andy will discuss ways in which we can increase the economic potential of residential energy efficiency as a grid resource. So with that, let's turn things over to Andy, and he'll get us.
Great. Well, thank you, Molly, for that introduction. I certainly also want to thank ACEEE for this opportunity to share some recent research that we've undertaken to look at cost-effective residential energy efficiency as a utility grid resource. I think it's important also to thank the Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office for supporting this work, and also important contributions from colleagues at the Brattle Group, led particularly by Ryan Leddick, as well as NREL. So thanks. This was certainly a group effort. So the study I'm going to present to you all today explores the value of energy efficiency as a utility grid resource, particularly in the context of a power system that is transforming towards more renewables and changing power demands. Specifically in this study, we identify how much cost-effective residential energy efficiency exists, how much remains, and what new program or policy initiatives can access that remaining amount. Importantly, we replicate the utility resource planning process and compete the energy efficiency with supply sides to identify the least cost portfolio to meet future electricity demand. In this study, as you'll see, we focus particularly on residential energy efficiency and for a prototypical summer peaking utility in the Southeast. Before I get into the assumptions, approach, and results, there's just a few study boundaries just to keep in mind. So the first one is that we explore cost effectiveness from the utility, not the customer's perspective. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by the utility cost effectiveness perspective. The second boundary is that we model several common energy efficiency measures and packages, but we don't consider all the possible residential efficiency measures or numerous and different performance assumptions. The third boundary here is that we characterize a utility that's intended to be generally representative of the Southeast United States, and we don't evaluate a broad range of utilities across a wide range of grid scenarios and taking lots of uncertainty into account. So the analysis uses a capacity expansion model, specifically a model that Brattle developed called the GridSim model. This is used to quantify the prototypical Southeastern utilities costs and demands over a 20-year planning horizon. As I mentioned before, this is a type of model that's commonly used in utility resource planning processes like integrated resource plans. The simulation in the model selects the energy efficiency by allowing it to compete with the supply side resources. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the energy efficiency benefits are represented as avoided system resource costs. So things like avoided capacity, energy, and ancillary service costs. We're also able to reflect and incorporate the costs, the resource costs of that energy efficiency to acquire it. And these costs are represented as participation incentives. So this would be the share of incremental equipment and installation costs, administrative and marketing costs. This is pretty typical to what you would consider sort of a total resource cost test using benefit cost frameworks. But done endogenously or within the model is competition with the supply side resources. The energy savings from these EE measures are modeled as 8760 hourly shapes, and our cost assumptions come from LBNL's cost of saving electricity database based on actual observed costs for energy efficiency programs. We grouped 7 energy efficiency measures. You can see here's the columns in this table into different packages depicted as the rows in this table. The hourly energy efficiency saving shapes were based on Southeast weather locations for Duke Energy Carolinas. This is consistent with an underlying utility load shape that was also based largely on Duke Energy Carolinas. The smart thermostat in the analysis is included as X-sponsor demand flexibility measure and is dispatched to reduce load in a limited number of annual hours using a pre-cooling strategy. Okay, so the results. So we begin first by comparing historically achieved annual residential energy efficiency savings among Southeast utilities. You can see here in the far left is 1.3% in annual residential energy efficiency savings. We compare that with the amount of cost-effective residential energy efficiency that we modeled, assuming average or typical costs, customer adoption, and grid characteristics. We call this a business as usual or BAU scenario. This business as usual or BAU cost-effective residential energy efficiency is almost 3 times higher than the historical amount. So we now begin implementing new program or policy initiatives in the model to see what they do to that level of cost-effective residential energy efficiency. So the first program and policy initiative that we modeled is a 40% reduction in the utilities' EE measure costs. This assumption is based on a literature review and ranges of observed EE measure costs pulled from LBNL's cost of saving electricity database. This type of initiative could represent R&D activities or technological advancements or other breakthroughs. By reducing energy efficiency costs in this manner, we increase the amount of cost-effective residential energy efficiency by about 2%. The second scenario we modeled assumed higher power system costs that represent some cost-related impact, like higher than anticipated fuel prices or shortages in raw materials for new generating plants, or even high construction labor costs. Specifically, we relied on other sources like the NREL's annual technology baseline conservative case to increase renewable capital costs. We also increased capital costs of new fossil generation by 10%, as well as its fixed O&M generation costs by 10%, and natural gas fuel costs were increased by 20%, all relative to that BAU. Given these assumptions, this increased the amount of cost-effective residential efficiency by about 0.4%. The third initiative that we modeled was efforts that drive increased customer adoption of energy efficiency measures. So for example, improved or direct customer marketing. Assuming energy efficiency adoption rates that are on the upper end of what has been achieved historically, we see about a 1.4% increase in cost-effective residential efficiency. The fourth initiative we modeled was a clean energy standard that essentially acts like a 40% RPS requirement. This assumption was based on a national review of RPS requirements to find the upper bound. Certainly not as aggressive as some or all utilities or state voluntary clean energy standards. This 40% policy in the Southeast is pretty aggressive given the context. And importantly, the energy efficiency is modeled to qualify as a clean energy resource, so those savings count directly toward the 40% requirement. Based on these assumptions, we find 1.5% more cost-effective residential efficiency for our prototypical Southeast utility. The fifth and final initiative is including all EE measures into a single comprehensive retrofit package. We reflect the interactive effects here between measures that reduce their impacts when implemented as a package. So for example, lower incremental air conditioning or air source heat pump savings due to building envelope improvements that happen at the same time. We also assume that the adoption of the packages can reach the highest rate of adoption from the standalone measures, and that the package cost per unit of saved energy is assumed to be equal to the lowest cost standalone measure. Given these assumptions, packaging the EE measures in this way achieved 0.7% more cost-effective residential energy efficiency. So if all those new program and policy initiatives were implemented, coupled with that scenario of increased grid costs, cost-effective residential efficiency could increase more than 7 times higher than what has been achieved historically in the Southeast. This translates into a 9.5% reduction in annual system sales by 2040. We also compared the cost-effective potential to a technical potential. This represented 100% participation among eligible customers for all our modeled measures. About 20% of the potential remains. This could be achieved through even more aggressive programs and policies than we modeled, or possibly by including additional residential energy efficiency measures beyond what we modeled. Even that said, capturing 80% of the technical potential through cost-effective measures is quite significant. I think it also suggests that there's not quite a large difference between technical and cost-effective energy efficiency potential as we see in other studies. So here we report our scorecard. This is the 20-year cumulative impacts of the cost-effective residential efficiency. The results, I think, are significant for both the business as usual scenario, with an almost 5% reduction in total power sector emissions and more than $1 billion in power sector system cost savings. And even more so significant when implementing all the initiatives that I just presented. This increases the avoided CO2 emissions almost 5 times and more than quadruples the power system cost savings to approximately $4.5 billion. So what does this all mean? Well, I think the study and the results provide a couple of key insights into residential utility grid resource. The first is that energy efficiency is a cost-effective in implementing one or even several of the new program or policy initiatives that we represented here. I think a second key to some of the most impactful initiatives appear in energy efficiency costs or driving higher program participation. This obviously suggests that continued R&D efforts for more breakthrough efficiency technologies is worthwhile, as well as the fact that these two complement each other, in which lower energy efficiency costs can drive higher participation because the out-of-pocket expense to the consumers may be lower, or you may be able to deliver more programs for a lower amount of dollars. Third, and finally, the packaging of EE measures can be a significant opportunity for cost-effective residential efficiency. But in our analysis, we actually found it to be a rather underexplored area. So as I mentioned before, we assumed fairly extreme conditions where the cost of packaging measures was the lowest cost based on the standalone measure, and adoption was the highest achieved. This is in part because we found little empirical evidence about the cost or adoption of package measures compared to standalone measures, and we wanted to provide just some bounding assumptions. So certainly further efforts to study both the costs, the performance, and the uptake of packaged energy efficiency measures could be a worthwhile endeavor and something to consider in the way that residential energy efficiency is deployed going forward. Again, I want to thank ACEEE for the opportunity to share our study. Ryan's and my contact information is provided here if anyone has any follow-up questions or comments on the analysis beyond what we can share in the discussion. So with that, Molly, I will hand it back to you. Thanks.
All right, fantastic. That was very insightful. Thank you, Andy. Our next speaker is Natalie Mims Frick of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab as well. Natalie is an energy efficiency program manager in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. Natalie conducts research and manages projects on energy efficiency and demand flexibility. Recently, her research has focused on grid interactive efficient buildings and utility demand flexibility programs, the time and locational aspects of efficiency and other distributed energy resources, energy efficiency as a resource in long-term electricity planning, and peak demand reductions from energy efficiency programs. Natalie will take a look at energy efficiency supply curves and how to incorporate those into system planning and markets. With that, I'm going to turn things to Natalie.
Great, thank you. Okay, thanks Molly for the introduction, and thanks to ACEEE for the opportunity to speak today, and the Building Technologies Office at DOE for funding this work. And as Molly said, I'm going to talk about examples of efficiency supply curves in integrated resource planning, or IRP. So first, what is an efficiency supply curve? It's several efficiency measures that are grouped together into discrete bundles or bins, which are referred to as supply curves. And each grouping represents the aggregate savings of a bundle of individual measures with its unique characteristics. And efficiency supply curves are used because efficiency potential is comprised of hundreds or maybe thousands of measures, and electricity capacity expansion models that are used in IRP typically can't simulate each one of those individual measures, or they can, but it would take too long. So on my slide, my chart on the right is efficiency potential supply curves from the Northwest Power Council's draft 8th plan. The x-axis is net levelized cost, and the y-axis is achievable technical potential over the 20-year planning period, and then each color represents a different sector. So why model efficiency as a selectable resource and use efficiency supply curves? In integrated resource planning best practice, analysts evaluate portfolios in an organized, holistic, and technology-neutral manner and identify resources from the supply and demand side. The essential idea of treating efficiency as a selectable resource is that its optimal level and timing are determined endogenously, meaning that efficiency becomes a decision variable that's directly comparable to amounts and timings of natural gas or renewable energy or any other resource. And this allows planners to choose from many resource options to create the least cost reliable portfolio that has an acceptable level of risk. And this approach for modeling efficiency is also useful because it can support many state objectives such as greater reliability and resilience, reduced electricity cost. It can help achieve efficiency targets, lower carbon emissions, things like that. So treating efficiency as a selectable resource requires a different process than using these resources as a load decrement, which is the most common way of considering efficiency in IRP. There's a variety of changes that need to happen in each of the steps of the IRP process. And in my little circle on the right side of the slide, I have 4 of the processes listed out: load forecasting, resource potential assessments, capacity expansion modeling, and risk and uncertainty analysis. There's many other components of IRP, but those are the ones that we focused on in our report. And today I'm going to focus on efficiency supply curves, which sits between the resource potential assessment and capacity expansion modeling. And if you want to learn more about the changes for those other processes, you can click on the link in the bottom right corner, which takes you to some of our recent research on efficiency in IRP. So in the past several years, a lot of states have begun considering energy efficiency as a resource. And some of these are examples of what I would characterize as an exploratory analysis, meaning that they're investigating allowing efficiency to directly compete with other resources, but it's often in tandem with using a resource potential assessment to actually identify the cost-effective efficiency that they're going to include in their IRP as a load reduction. And then some of these are examples where the efficiency supply curves are only being used to identify the optimal timing and quantity of efficiency included in their plans. And I have an asterisk in the title because these are all of the states and utilities that I'm aware of. So if I have an omission, please let me know. So this is the main takeaway from my presentation. There's lots of states and utilities that are considering efficiency as a selectable resource, but all of the approaches are not created equal. And the approach that you use to create your efficiency supply curves is going to impact the quantity of efficiency that's available to the model and also the quantity of efficiency that's selected by the model. And the rest of my slides talk about that and provide examples of it. So I'm not going to talk through all of these points. I'll cover them as I go through my examples. I'll start with California. This slide shows 4 different approaches that Guidehouse or Navigant tested for creating efficiency supply curves as part of a proof of concept to explore policy, process, and technical challenges and opportunities of using efficiency as a selectable resource in IRP in the state. And as part of the process, Guidehouse assessed how well each of these 4 bundling measures modeled disaggregated measures with the goal of identifying what bundling approach most aligned with the savings and the cost of the individual measures. So in all of these charts, the x-axis is energy, the y-axis is levelized cost. Starting in the top left, the sector level bundles, which are the green line, are much more expensive than the disaggregated measures, which are the black lines, even at the low cost side of the curve, which is the left side of the chart. Moving over to the top right, the end use level bundles performed better on the low cost side, but not on the high cost side. And then moving down to the bottom left, sector plus end use improved on both the low and high cost side. And then if you go to the bottom right, the bundles are created by grouping by sector, end use, and cost. And this is the bundle that most closely followed the disaggregated measure costs. So the takeaway here, there's lots of different approaches. You can bundle them by sector, by end use, by program, by cost, by some other combination, and it's going to impact the quantity and the cost of the savings that are included in that bundle. So my next example is from Georgia. This is another exploratory analysis. It's from Georgia Power. They created residential and commercial bundles, and they grouped them in 3 different ways by load shape, similar cost, and similar value. And on this slide, we're only looking at the residential examples. And so this is another example of different methods producing different results. So each one of these approaches for commercial has a different quantity of efficiency that's available at the levelized cost of $20 a megawatt hour, which is one of the lower cost bins. So on the right side, the load shape bundles have 217,000 megawatt hours available. On the left, the value-based bundles have 205,000 megawatt hours. And then in the center, the cost-based bundles have 206,000 megawatt hours. So pretty significant difference between the load shape bundles and the value and the cost-based bundles. So again, another example of different methods creating different savings at the same cost. And then on my earlier slide, one of the points was that when you're creating bundles, the net levelized cost should take into account any benefits that aren't accrued in the capacity expansion model. And an example of this is avoided distribution system costs. And you can't see that on this slide, but Georgia Power did take into account avoided distribution system values when they were creating their net levelized costs. So my next example is in Indiana, and they have several bundling approaches that are being used. In the top left, NIPSCO created 3 efficiency bundles based on utility incentive cost. On the top right and bottom left, IPL and Vectren created bundles based on their incremental annual net kilowatt hours in increments of 0.25% savings. And then on the bottom right, Duke Energy created bundles that represent their existing efficiency portfolio for the first few years of their IRP, and then bundles based on their new portfolio that's going to be approved. And then in 2027, they start offering bundles to the model that's based on levelized cost per megawatt hour. So there's a couple takeaways from the slide. First, there's lots of different approaches that are being used in Indiana. And second, this also doesn't appear on the slide, but all of these utilities were screening efficiency measures for cost effectiveness prior to creating their efficiency bundles, which is a common approach. So they were using a subset of their economic potential as a starting point for creating their efficiency bundles. So that's effectively screening your efficiency twice, once in the cost-effective potential in your potential study, and then again in your capacity expansion model. And also similar to Georgia Power, they did include costs that don't accrue in their capacity expansion model for efficiency, such as avoided distribution system costs in their net levelized costs. So my last example on efficiency approaches, I have 2 more slides on results, is for PacifiCorp. And this is another illustration of how bundling measures creates different results. These are 2 slides from PacifiCorp's stakeholder engagement process from their 2021 IRP. They've been doing efficiency supply curves for several IRP cycles. The slide on the left illustrates the importance of creating more granular measure bundles around the inflection point where the model does and does not select resources, or the cost-effective threshold. So The measure bundles that are in the green circle were always selected by the model, and the measure bundles in the red circle weren't. And so the bundles in the middle section at the beginning and at the beginning of the red section, if they're grouped into smaller segments with less volume, create more opportunities for the model to select those. And they may or may not be picked based on optimization, but focusing on that area where your model may or may not be selecting efficiency is a way to see what is in and out. So the slide on the right is another example of how different approaches create different results. This has two curves. The orange line is the supply curve based on the levelized cost of energy, and this is an example from Utah. And then the blue line is the supply curve based on the net cost of capacity. And the chart calls out where the lines diverge at about the 50 megawatt mark. And if you're looking at the blue line where the bundles were created using the net cost of capacity, it provides the same quantity of efficiency at 31% less cost. So very clear example of bundles creating different values. So one of the takeaways from this is that considering efficiency as a resource is an iterative process, and you can update it as you move along and as your system needs change. And the reason that PacifiCorp started looking at the net cost of capacity was to better align their efficiency with the seasonal variations in their load forecast and identifying summer and winter peak resources. So I have two examples of results that I'll share. They're both illustrative. So this is from Idaho Power's 2019 IRP, which tested efficiency supply curves as an alternative to using their potential study to identify cost-effective efficiency. So for their bundling technique, they created 10 technical achievable bundles based on net levelized cost and then bundled them together by percentile. And then an 11th bundle was created to capture higher cost measures that were over $250 a megawatt hour. And that's the table that's shown on the left side of the slide. And then their load forecast includes energy efficiency. So this was just, an exercise to see what would happen. And the chart on the right side shows that the model selected 70% of the supply curves, which is that bottom wedge that's brighter green. And then the teal wedge that's on top is the efficiency that was in the remaining bundles that was not selected. So there's a couple takeaways from this slide. First, interestingly, the green wedge is approximately the quantity of efficiency that the company's potential study identified as cost effective. So they found that their model and their potential study were quite similar. Second, putting a large range of end uses or costs into your bundles is going to limit the ability of your model to select those. And this is the same thing I was talking about with PacifiCorp. So for example, if you look at the chart on the left, bundle 6 costs had a levelized cost of $69, or the average cost of $69 a megawatt hour. And then the next bundle up was $131 a megawatt hour. And so thinking about if there's smaller volumes that you could create that have a higher granularity cost profile may allow the model to select more. And then this is my last example. Ameren Missouri's 2021 IRP developed 4 portfolios for their IRP, which are shown in the chart that's on the slide. The light gray is the maximum achievable potential. Dark gray is realistic achievable potential. And then the 2 green wedges are dynamically optimized portfolio extension groupings. The supply curves are a subset of the realistic achievable potential, and they represent the quantity of efficiency that the model selected based on the ability to meet the first identified resource need, which was defined to be 1,000 megawatts in the 2034 to 2036 time period. So this was a quite constrained look at what efficiency could do. The portfolio level dynamically optimized portfolio extension was creating using supply curves that were based on a program that starts, but then doesn't stop, so it performs continuously. And then the measure level dynamically optimized portfolios is similar, where it selected measures that started and then they run for the duration of the study. And so again, this is illustrative because Ameren used their load forecast reduction with efficiency to determine the amount of efficiency in the IRP, but they were using this process to evaluate the implications of alternative policy goals and targets on the resource plan and considering risk and resource acquisition processes. So a little bit of a different look at how to use the supply curves. This is my last slide. If any of this sounds interesting to you, we have lots of technical assistance opportunities, particularly if you work for a state energy office or a public utility commission, We have technical assistance available on the specific topic, on creating efficiency supply curves, and a variety of other topics as well. And with that, I will hand it back to Molly. My last slide is just a disclaimer, and then my contact info as well.
All right, thank you so much for that. Again, that was very insightful. So we're going to prepare now for our final speaker. Our third speaker is Nicholas Wyatt. He is an energy efficiency business and intelligence analyst for Eversource Energy, focusing on the commercial and industrial customers and assisting energy efficiency sales team. He has been with Eversource for 4 years under the leadership of Kara Marshall. Before joining Eversource, he worked at WEI as a sales operation analyst and as a pricing analyst for Integris Energy. He graduated from Merrimack College in 2009 with a business finance degree. In his free time, he likes to spend time with his friends, family, wife is Rhea, and 3-year-old daughter Avery, golf, and is what he describes as a very amateur woodworker, but I'm sure he's being humble. All right, with that, let's turn things over to Nicholas.
Hi, Molly. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you. First, I want to thank ACEEE for allowing me to present today. We're going to start off looking at utilizing energy resources for enhanced system planning. So first, we're going to start looking at Eversource. For those who don't know who we are, we're the largest energy company in New England, serving the customers about 4 million electric, natural gas, and water customers across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. We have about 8,300 employees across those 3 states. And we have been ranked #1 in energy efficiency provider in the nation, according to CERES, and #1 in utilities on the Forbes 2020 America's Most Just Companies. Just taking a look at some of the energy efficiency programs we have. So Mass Save is for Massachusetts, where we partner with other utilities across the state to help residential and commercial businesses save energy and money through energy efficiency programs and measures. New Hampshire has New Hampshire Saves, and Connecticut has Energize Connecticut. So we're going to look at answering 3 questions today. What was our opportunity, whether it was targeting specific customer projects for our C&I customers, or looking at the grid as a whole in terms of demand response and battery storage, how we delivered it, what data sources did we use, and then how we did the analysis, and then how the implementation team and the system planning team use this analysis. So some of our main objectives, the first one, what was being asked. So the key objective for this analysis was to evaluate on a substation and circuit level whether traditional energy efficiency programs and projects such as lighting and HVAC measures or demand response or battery storage projects could be used to alleviate system constraints. We first had to understand who the customers are on the related substations. Are the majority of the customers residential? Are they retail? Are they manufacturing? Then we analyzed how those customers are using energy. Are they using it through heating or non-heating processes, general use, or facility processes? And by gathering the data through various data sources that we have at Eversource, we could answer these questions. And on the next slide, we'll explore the 4 resources we had used. So the first thing we're going to look at is our segmentation model, which is our proprietary segmentation model, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that now. So in order to answer the questions of what type of customers are being serviced by a particular service or circuit or substation, we need to gather the necessary customer data to perform our analysis. The first source of data is our billing data, where we can see how much a customer is using on a month-to-month basis and how it's being consumed through the account's rate code. Our second source is our segmentation model. This model allows us to aggregate billing accounts or smaller customers into a group of customers. So we call them clusters. So what we will do in parent clusters. What we do is we aggregate billing accounts of the like customers. So say for a municipality, for the city of Boston, we have the Department of Public Works. So we have all those billing accounts that roll up to the city of Boston Department of Public Works cluster, and then all the different departments that fall underneath the city of Boston as a whole umbrella roll up to that parent cluster. We also assigned segments and subsegments to those clusters that help us identify what type of customer they are, whether they're retail grocery stores, whether they're food and beverage manufacturers, or government offices, or the different departments within a municipality. We also assign what we call a quartile. So we aggregate the usage from the billing accounts all the way up to the parent cluster level and rank them highest to lowest. Our Q1 customers being our larger customers, and our Q4 customers being our small business and micro businesses. And we also can go through an address standardization process where we can identify accounts at a particular building or dwelling for those multifamily examples. Our third data source is our historical participation data. It allows us to identify customers who have participated in an energy efficiency project in the past, or those who have not participated at all. If they have participated, we have a granular look where we can actually see what measures were used, and depending on what the measure life of those measures were, we can reinstall more efficient measures. And then the last source, and probably the most important data source, is our circuit data. So using our outage management system, or OMS system, we can identify what customers are on a particular circuit and subsegment, substation, excuse me, and provide GPS coordinates for those customers' assets. In this case, would be the meters. And this allows us to isolate our customer population that we wanted to target. So getting into some of the aspects of our analysis, the first graph visualizes the monthly usage of all our customers on the substation that we decided to look at by their rate class. This shows the higher usage months in particular rate classes that illustrates the magnitude of which of the rate classes consumes energy. We can see here from the graph here that about 45% of the customers' usage on this substation is for the commercial customers, and about 20% is on the residential. And we stack them up, looking at state municipals, residential heating, and federal and lighting. Similarly to the last graph, this is where we pull in our segmentation model, where we identify what types of commercial customers they are. So we have the residential at the bottom, it's kind of all-encompassing there. But then we actually get into the government seeing how much usage we have for the government agencies or manufacturing or retail customers that are on this substation. And we actually see where the peaks are in those summer months in 2018. And then using the GPS coordinates, the usage data, and then utilizing Power BI, we are able to create these location and heat maps to pinpoint concentrated areas where there is heavy usage, signified by that bright yellow area of the graph. Using our customer aggregation model, the clusters and the parent clusters, we can identify high users to promote more comprehensive energy efficiency projects to better serve not just a single location, but also all the locations in a customer's profile. And then we also were able to pull in interval data for those accounts that have the interval recorders. Eversource has about 25,000 interval recorders across the 3 states. We do not currently have AMI infrastructure in place, but we have a filing in order to get those funds so we can achieve that. But once we have those, which 25,000 customers represents roughly under 1% of our electric customers across those 3 states. And by linking the meter service points of those interval recorders to actual billing accounts, we can apply that segmentation model to create a baseline for a particular customer segment and offer more targeted EE programs and offerings for them. And this also allows us to look at the customer's usage pattern, when and where their peak occurs in terms of them themselves, on the ISO peak, the circuit peak, and even the substation peak, and see if they are contributing to the strain of that substation. So now we're going to get into the implementation of the analysis. So once the initial analysis was presented to the system planning's team, the team made some general assumptions in how they can calculate in multiple aspects. First being the customer class. Being able to classify the population by rate class, it allowed the team to estimate an amount of savings that could be achieved on a broader scale. For example, residential customers at a 20% conversion rate could equal X amount of kW savings using lighting measures. Likewise, commercial customers could achieve X amount of savings through a combination of HVAC and lighting measures. Looking at seasonal impacts, identifying when those summer peaking customers are, and then using a projected out of design condition for capacity constraints over various periods of time to better understand how to better serve the substation. For example, if the substation is out of spec 5 times a year for only 2 hours, maybe the best solution would be the demand response or the battery storage projects. But if it's out of spec for 12 hours, demand response and battery storage may not be necessarily the right choice of action there. So we'll explore more energy efficiency measures, and then reassess that and look at demand response and battery storage after that. And then lastly, the cost benefit analysis. And once the team develops the various EE solutions, they then perform a cost benefit analysis against the traditional substation infrastructure upgrades. Are the recommended EE measures accomplishing the goal and decreasing the strain on the substation, or are there more traditional options the more correct course of action there? And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I did not include my contact information, but I can certainly, in the Zoom meeting, I can provide my email address as well and contact information. And thank you for listening.
All right, fantastic. So I would ask everyone at this point, if you have questions for our awesome speakers today, please pop them in the chat. We'll start addressing those. When we do run short on time, we'll conclude, but we have a Zoom room set up where we can continue Q&A after. Okay, we'll give people just a few minutes to pop their questions in the chat. While we're waiting for that, I would love to hear any questions you might have for each other, or any thoughts on how you've learned from each other's presentations, or how some of the findings that you guys have shared today would fit in to each other's research. Any thoughts?
I mean, to some extent, I thought what I just presented was a good example of some of the targeted marketing for particular customers who might be able to take better advantage of energy efficiency investments in particular, and that would speak to, I think, that particular initiative that we modeled in our study, looking at the incremental ability of higher adoption. And in particular, utilities like Eversource, if they're able to really target those investments and drive the benefit side of the equation, that's just more cost-effective or in this case it was commercial, but you could also do on the residential side, that's more cost-effective efficiency. So there's some nice synergies there, I think, in the ways that folks are thinking about driving higher adoption, utilities in particular, that could be quite powerful.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Any thoughts there to share? Natalie or Nicholas? Or anything that you'd like to share with the audience that you just didn't have time to put in your presentation, because these things are so tight. You have like 10 minutes and you've got to address everything very quickly. Or maybe tell me one question that you wish the audience would ask you. All right. Hold that thought because we're probably still going to get to it. So I have from Donald Johnson. For Nicholas, do you incorporate EE into demand forecasting, either system-wide or for specific networks or circuits?
Not necessarily for my team. That would be more on the system planning team to do the analysis on that at that point. But our job really is to be able to do that targeting, look at and being able to classify those customers and break that substation and circuit in a more granular level. So finding those targeted areas to focus on for the demand response programs or the battery storage programs.
Fantastic. All right, we have from Mary Spragren. Andy, curious why behavioral EE, hold on just a second. These aren't loading fully. Andy, curious why behavioral EE wasn't included as a measure in the analysis, not an option in the grid sim capacity expansion model.
Yeah, it wasn't intentional. I think we started with a list of measures that were at the time priority of interest for the folks that we were working with in BTO. You certainly could include it. There's nothing that would prevent you from building an hourly shape and some cost assumptions around behavioral energy efficiency. I think the question around the hourly shape is kind of fascinating. I think it depends how the program's implemented and the extent to which folks are making sort of pretty predictable, depending on the technology they're using to respond to those behavioral incentives, or whether it's sort of one-time or event-based. But there's precedence there and research that's been done to develop those shapes. So yeah, you could certainly include it. And I would say, as far as it thinking about our results, I mean, my understanding is it's a fairly cost-effective residential efficiency program or measure, and so I think it would only just increase. Think about that difference we had between the cost-effective and the technical potential amount. I think it would just further, bridge that gap and increase the cost-effective amount.
Yeah, great question. All right, and we have from Emily Levin. Natalie, can you talk more about the issues that might arise if a utility applies cost-effectiveness screening if trying to select EE as a supply-side resource, and the risks of this is big, and the risks of double counting conflict if EE is counted as both a decrement on the demand side and as a supply side resource at the same time? And let me know if you want me to repeat any of that. Oh, I think you might be on mute. Oh, it looks like we're having audio issues. We have a technical assistant. Is it possible to assess how we can get her off mute? Okay, the producer is taking a look, so we'll get back to that in just a second. All right, others, while we're pausing to respond to Emily's question, please do share any questions you have in the chat.
I think, I'll take a stab at Emily's question, if only because I've learned so much from Natalie, and certainly this is something we talk about a lot at the lab. I think what Emily's question is really pointing to, kind of two common approaches, but are quite different, right? Is do you assess the cost effectiveness exogenously or outside the resource planning framework, or within it? If you assess it outside of the framework, I think there's a couple of concerns. One is those are often for a short period of time. So it's often for like an EE filing program cycle. So it's like 3 years of program benefits. Whereas there's a resource supply study, resource planning process, it can be 10, 20 years. We were able in our study that looked at 20 years out to take into account that full economic lifetime of those measures. So as they ran through their lifetime of 10, 11, 12 years, what was that lifetime of benefits? And that's important when you're planning for long-lived assets like generation capacity. So I think that's a potential mismatch. And certainly, if you're applying these cost-effectiveness screening outside the model, you don't get some of these important feedback loops where energy efficiency can actually reduce some of the fuel cost requirements or the purchase power costs. So anyways, I think obviously jurisdictions need to decide how they want to do it. I think what's really interesting in Natalie's analysis is showing this is no longer, like, incorporating EE into a resource planning process is no longer this sort of mystical thing. I mean, a lot of utilities are doing it. They're doing it in very novel ways. There's ways to get around some of the data constraints and modeling constraints in very thoughtful ways. So hopefully that's a trend that we see to continue.
Okay, fantastic. Natalie, are you able to get through yet? If not, they're suggesting that you exit entirely and come back in. And I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but we have still a few minutes if you want to give it a try. All right. So one question for Nicholas. I'm going to put you a little on the spot to ask your own question. Oh, and it can't hear you either. I hope that
I haven't said anything yet.
Okay, good. So
I'm just mouthing.
Fantastic. What's a question that you wish the audience had for you, or a question that you would be asking yourself if you were in the audience?
I mean, I think it would be, that's a good one.
You want a minute to think, because it looks like we got
yeah.
Yeah,
Give me a
Natalie.
second.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Yes.
can. You're fully with us.
So I didn't do anything different, but now it magically works. Anyway. So all of the points that Andy made were good, and I agree with all of them. I guess the only things I would have to add to that are that when you are screening the efficiency outside of the cost effectiveness, or when you're screening efficiency outside of your capacity expansion, then you're excluding efficiency that might be selected for different reasons. It might be expensive, but it's providing capacity at a time when you really need it. And so if you already took it off the table, it's never going to be picked. So that's one problem with it. And then in terms of load forecasting, it's very challenging to figure out what efficiency you want to keep in and out of your load forecast. And you can't have it in the load forecast and in your capacity expansion model, because it's only going to happen once. And so you have to count it as one or the other. There's a lot of different ways to get around it. But you just have to be thoughtful in your approach to it. And, in the Northwest, which has been doing it the longest, they only put codes and standards and then savings from appliance and equipment turnover into the load forecast, and everything else, including programs that are, going to start in 2 years, go into the capacity expansion model to see if they're cost effective, because they might have been cost effective 2 years ago, but that doesn't mean they're going to continue to be. So those are some other thoughts on that. And then Andy, to follow up on your response about, or whoever's question about behavioral efficiency, interestingly enough, North Carolina, South Carolina, generally the Southeast, has very high savings quantities for their portfolio from behavioral programs. So you might not have been able to max it out too much more beyond what they were already doing. So just 2 cents on that.
Very good point. All right, so I'm going to come back to you, Nicholas, but first I do want to address the last question in the chat here from Michael Kenny. For anyone, how might the amount of energy efficiency selected in an IRP process change as the marginal resource evolves over time, say from gas peaker plant to battery?
I think the short answer is it would definitely change the amount. Certainly as the marginal resource, especially as it gets less expensive, then certainly the amount of cost-effective efficiency, all else being equal, no other changes, would certainly drop. One thing to mention is that, there's, and this is certainly the case in high renewable systems, where it does put a downward pressure on the marginal price. At the same time, you have to take into account the fact that renewables are capital intensive, that while they have sort of a zero marginal fuel cost, right, it's renewable energy, which is great, there is a capital cost associated with that. One of the reasons why we saw such large impacts in our clean energy standard initiative that we modeled, it was actually one of the most impactful initiatives, is because the energy efficiency counted towards that standard and was then able to offset the capital costs associated with the renewables that would have to otherwise be built to meet that clean energy standard. That's an interesting, it's admittedly a bit of a modeling nuance and kind of in the weeds, but it's an interesting factor to think about as the role of energy efficiency in these types of standards. Clean energy standards and RPS, if they can count directly towards it, they do have that additional benefit. So it's not just competing on that marginal energy price, it's actually reducing the capital requirements.
Andy and I actually talked about this yesterday in the context of the Northwest Power Council's 8th Power Plan, because this is one of the discussions they have quite a bit of information about. They switched, so battery is their avoided cost and there's not as much efficiency in the plan as there has been historically because you're not avoiding energy costs, as Andy was saying. So it certainly shifts it. I mean, however, if you look at PacifiCorp's IRP, they have quite a bit more efficiency than they planned in their 2019 IRP in their out years. And it's because they need the capacity. And so efficiency is offsetting other high cost resources, and thinking about what you're using your efficiency for, the timing of it, and how it can help your system at the times when you need it, as opposed to just an annual energy savings reduction number or annual energy savings number, is, I think, the way that we have to think about efficiency moving forward, particularly in resource planning.
Great. All right, fantastic questions and fantastic answers. We're almost at the end here, so we're going to have to conclude, but just any parting thoughts, Nicholas, to share?
No, I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to us three. This is my first one, so I was a little nervous. So if I stumble through it, I appreciate you powering through with me. But everything was so interesting. What Natalie and Andy are doing is it's awesome information. So I definitely want to review it again and go over it, because it's a lot of good information there.
What you presented was top notch as well. Thank you guys so much. All right, so a little bit of closing messaging here. And this is very brief. Basically, thank you all. Thank you for joining. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the great questions. As we said, there's a Zoom chat here link. There's a link to the Zoom chat room. We can go have extended Q&A, talk to two people live. It's a bit more personal than just being able to type your question in the chat. So if you would like to take advantage of that, please meet us in there and we'll reconvene in just a moment. All right. Thank you so much.